Yes. So, okay. I'll present quickly. Thanks for having me. I'm in the U.S. at Eastern Time, and I was up until 1 a.m. And it's 5:30 right now. So what I just woke up in the start and had already missed my presentation. So I'm happy to be here and presenting. I can't. I'm honestly, yeah, very grateful. So this is very much an experimental sort of start of a project. I'm going to do not much in motivating this for you. I'm just going to start explaining what exactly I started to do, and maybe you'll have some idea of the motivation or why this is a bad idea. Whatever ideas I'm open to. So I called this Dialogues in Science. My idea was to try to, and maybe I'll pull up the diagram now, try to extract conversations from the literature, conversations being sequences of interactions between two sets of authors. So, basic unit of analysis, as I'm displaying here, is a paper, three papers, A cites B cites C, where A and C share an author, at least one author, um, and the authors on A and C don't intersect with the authors on the paper B. So it's an interaction between two separate groups. This is the so-called conversational turn. So I've cited your paper, and then you've cited my paper, which cited your paper. A very simple sort of interaction that we might expect to happen all the time in science. Um, and the first question that I asked is just how often does this happen? These conversational turns on the left here. So I've got 5 social sciences from the Web of Science, just all of their publications. And as I think we all know, there's been an explosion in science. So there's also, we would expect an explosion in these sort of conversational turns. Um, and I think this is a useful way to sort of look at this. Let me see if I can zoom out slightly. So if we look at a single paper, at all the citations in that paper, we may ask how many of those citations are completing a conversational turn? How many of those citations are, citing somebody who has cited a paper that you've written? And it turns out, at least from my perspective, to be quite low. That your interaction with outside research, which then is outside being not a part of, the team on your paper, um, yeah, it's less than one, far less than one, and it's only for psychology that we've even since 2010 breached an average of one conversational turn being completed per paper. Um, and maybe it's already interesting to see that psychology is sort of pulling away from the other social sciences by quite a significant margin. Um, and for me to see economics not pulling away so significantly was already a little bit of a surprising um, finding. Another initial question that uh, an initial question that I asked is how long do these conversational turns typically take? So if I go back to this diagram, what's the time difference between the publication of A and C in this diagram? We may imagine that conversational turns in a productive and interactive discipline, maybe these take 5, 10 years, um, maybe less in a very quick moving field. But if we compute the average delay for conversational turns that are being completed in any year, we see that they're taking on average, it's been increasing over time. And, as of 2010 here, it's over 12 years on average. The conversational turns that people are completing, researchers are completing in their papers are actually quite long-term, conversational turns. So these were already two basic observational findings that I found rather surprising. Also, in this diagram, I mean, I expected psychology to be moving much quicker, just intuitively speaking. I expected the average time for their turns to be something like 5 years or something. Um, and here's an alternative way to look at this, which is the ratio between short-term conversations, the number of short-term conversations that you're having in terms of, I think I said 5 years or less versus all the rest. And it's something like, there are one fifth, a quint, a fifth as many 5-year conversational turns as more than 5-year conversational turns. So the timing of these also seems to be something rather interesting, at least in the social sciences. I'm already anticipating, I guess, the interest in looking at harder sciences, the physics, the computer science, the others. I just simply didn't have the data when I was producing these figures. A couple analytical next steps I took. One was to imagine, okay, now we've got these turns. We can consider for each conversational turn where, author, here we have author one sort of responding to a paper in which, which cited one of their papers. We can consider this as a directed tie. I call it, auth one pointing to auth two means that they are completing auth two's conversational turn, so we can kind of consider auth two as, auth one is conversing with auth two is kind of my interpretation when looking at the graph. And unfortunately, like I had planned to wake up much earlier to actually give you a bit more. This is Alec from the future. I just wanted to say I did build that thing. It was so close when I fell asleep. But it's just a zoomable version of what I'll show you in a second. So you can see the directed edges to and from different people. And I have all 5 fields here. These are just the top 1,000 edges, as well as some examples. So here we have max out degree individual from psychology, to see what they look like, max in degree, and max out degree in sociology. So I just wanted to poke and say that author-convos.alecmcgill.com, I'll put a link in the description. In terms of the actual network, I do have sort of a whole interactive framework and have pulled out some interesting examples, but I can tell you some, I guess, initial findings. So the interesting thing about this is it creates a network between authors. So who is engaging in conversations in terms of continually responding to people who are responding to them, and who is receiving these more than not. So these are people with high out degree or people with high in degree. It turns out that the stars, maybe you can already see from this high-level overview that there are stars. These stars are stars in terms of out degree, mostly. So these are people who are engaging outside with a lot of other people's, interactions with their work. And very infrequently do we have somebody that's high degree because a lot of people are interacting with their responses to the other person's work. I hope this isn't too confusing. I also found, but didn't express in these slides, that reciprocity is extremely low. You find a lot of these situations where, I have sort of engaged in a conversational term with you 7 papers or 5 papers or something like that, and you've never reciprocated. Or you've reciprocated once or something like that. So reciprocity also seems to be an interesting feature of these networks in general. But if you start looking at the stars, I think it also pulls out interesting individual examples of researchers. So I also was going down the qualitative rabbit hole of trying to understand who are these people. I mean, the names were popping out. So that's as far as I can really say about that right now. So I'll just continue. So a natural extension of this is, okay, we have a conversational term. What about longer conversations? What about conversations that last 4 or 5 or 6 turns in an interaction between one or more authors in A, like this A block, and one or more authors in this B block? And again, there is no intersection between any of the authors on these A1, A2, etc. papers and these B1, B2, etc. papers. So it really is an interaction between two disjoint groups of authors. One thing we may look at is just the distribution. So this unlabeled graph is the probability distribution over conversation length for different fields. So here we see that for psychology, about 65% of conversations have length 3, if they happen at all. Only 40% or so continue on beyond that, and we actually see in psychology there are some very long conversations, 8 or 9 turns. Whereas in political science, there's actually no conversations that last more than 5 turns. And 85% of them end after the first turn. So there's something of a very low interaction going on there, and I'll just end with some examples. So this is, if we look in the journal Social Networks and look for conversations that occur completely within that journal, this is the longest one. It was 5 turns between Patrick Dorian and Stephen Borgatti talking about two-mode networks. I thought this was relatively interesting example. I thought it was interesting at all that there was a 5-turn conversation within social networks when actually 5-turn conversations are so rare anyways. And I actually went and extracted the references themselves for these papers. So here we have the original paper, 1979, that quote-unquote initiates the conversation. The response simply refers to Dorian using Q analysis. So it's a little bit of a peripheral citation. And that's 20 years later. Okay, so I don't even know if this first, anyway, we'll continue. So then 7 years later, there was a reference. So Borgatti and Everett provide a pictorial representation of bipartite graph for the Southern Women dataset and advocate for the inclusion of analyses of the bipartite matrix in the analysis of two-mode data. So the start of an interaction actually on the specific artifact of this data set. And we have a response here a full 9 years later. Dorian has challenged that there are 2 groups of women in this data, right? And suggested that 3 groups is a better fit. And actually he goes on to agree. We did 2 and 3 groups, and we agree that 3 groups is he actually says more interesting. 3 groups is more interesting. The final conversational turn just involving them in a long list of people who use two-mode data. So we see this mix of sort of peripheral citation, especially at the end, whereas this turn is in the middle is actually interacting on a specific sort of artifact, trying to understand the specific data set. Here's the longest chain, which includes a social networks paper. It's actually just right at the very end. So all of this interaction about power and exchange theory happening between it looks like Bonnekick and David Willer are the crucial authors. So yeah, this also gives an illustration of what exactly I was talking about. So Willer is on all of these papers on the left-hand side, and Bonnekick is on all of the papers on the right-hand side. Nothing specific to Sorry to move so quickly, but yeah, there's nothing really specific to say here except to try to give you some intuition for what I've been extracting. And here's some other sort of the other highest social network specific conversations. Right, so we have some block modeling conversation going on here. This this is talking about uh, actually response in surveys. Apologies, and the final one is an interaction on negative ties. But as I've found, we end up getting these really popular papers at the very base of the conversation. So I think digging into the qualitative aspects of this, I'm trying to get a better idea of what exactly to look for. So I hope this was interesting, and I'll leave it there.